While serving food in the cafeteria, Dorothy Henderson heard the alarms. She'd been hearing these sounds for 12 years, but this time was different. 30 years of nuclear engineering experience told her the reactor was approaching critical levels. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise walking among us. The Pine Valley nuclear power plant stood like a concrete fortress against the Arizona desert landscape, its twin cooling towers releasing harmless steam into the morning sky, as the facility provided clean electricity to 500,000 homes across the Southwest. Inside the plant's cafeteria, Dorothy Henderson arranged fresh sandwiches and soup containers with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd spent 12 years ensuring that nuclear workers had hot meals available around the clock. At 63, Dorothy moved with the quiet grace of someone who'd found peace in simple, reliable work that served others without requiring the intense mental demands of her previous career. To the engineers, technicians, and security personnel who ate in her cafeteria, she was simply Dot, a friendly woman who remembered everyone's favorite coffee order and always had a warm smile for workers coming off difficult shifts. They had no idea that Dorothy Henderson held a PhD in nuclear engineering from MIT, or that she'd spent 30 years designing and operating some of the most advanced nuclear reactor systems in the United States. Her colleagues at Pine Valley knew her as the cafeteria worker who made excellent chili and never complained about working holidays. They didn't know she'd once been Dr. Dorothy Henderson, lead engineer on the team that developed next-generation reactor safety systems for the Department of Energy. At 10:23 a.m. on Tuesday morning, Dorothy was refilling the soup warmers when she heard something that made her pause in her routine. The facility's normal operational sounds, the quiet hum of ventilation systems, the distant vibration of cooling pumps, the soft electronic beeps of monitoring equipment, were being interrupted by alarm tones that her trained ear recognized immediately. Level 2 safety alerts weren't uncommon at nuclear facilities. They typically indicated minor system anomalies that required attention but posed no immediate danger to plant operations or public safety. Dorothy had heard hundreds of such alarms during her 12 years in the cafeteria, learning to distinguish between routine maintenance alerts and more serious operational concerns. But this Tuesday morning, the alarm patterns were different. The sequence and frequency suggested escalating problems with primary cooling systems, and Dorothy's 3 decades of nuclear engineering experience told her that what she was hearing indicated potential reactor control issues. Dorothy set down her serving ladle and moved to the cafeteria's small service window, which provided a view of the main corridor leading to the reactor control room. Through the reinforced glass, she could see technicians moving with the urgent purpose that indicated a developing crisis situation. Her training from decades of reactor operations kicked in automatically. Dorothy began mentally cataloging the alarm sequences, cross-referencing them with her knowledge of Pine Valley's reactor design and safety systems. What she was hearing suggested primary coolant flow irregularities, combined with control rod positioning problems, a combination that could lead to serious overheating if not addressed quickly. Just cafeteria alarms, Dorothy told herself, trying to maintain the careful separation between her current job and her former expertise. For 12 years, she'd successfully avoided involving herself in the plant's technical operations, content to serve meals, and let younger engineers handle the complex problems of nuclear reactor management. But as the alarm tones continued and intensified, Dorothy's professional instincts overcame her desire to remain uninvolved. She approached Jake Morrison, a young reactor technician who'd stopped by the cafeteria for coffee during what was clearly a stressful shift. "Jake," Dorothy said quietly, "is everything all right with the plant operations today?" Jake looked tired and worried as he poured coffee with hands that showed slight tremor from stress. "Oh, hi Dot. Yeah, we're having some issues with the primary cooling system. Control room's working on it." Dorothy's engineering background kicked in automatically. "What kind of cooling system issues?" Jake paused, clearly debating how much information to share with someone outside the technical staff. "Coolant flow rates are fluctuating, and we're seeing some unusual control rod behavior. Nothing dangerous, but the engineers are trying to figure out what's causing the irregularities." Dorothy felt her pulse quicken. Coolant flow fluctuations combined with control rod problems were exactly the type of cascading failures that could lead to reactor overheating. If the cooling system couldn't maintain proper heat removal while control rods weren't responding predictably, the reactor core temperature could rise beyond safe operating parameters. "How long have these problems been developing?" Dorothy asked, her voice carrying a professional concern that made Jake look at her more carefully. "About 2 hours now. Started with minor flow variations, but it's been getting progressively worse." Dorothy's mind was racing through the technical implications. 2 hours of escalating cooling problems meant the reactor's heat removal capacity was being progressively compromised. If the trend continued, they could face a situation where reactor temperature exceeded design limits. "Jake, has anyone considered the possibility that you're dealing with a stuck control rod mechanism affecting coolant circulation patterns?" Jake stared at the cafeteria worker who'd just suggested a technical diagnosis that he hadn't heard from the engineering team. How do you know about control rod mechanisms and coolant circulation? Dorothy realized she'd revealed knowledge that was inconsistent with her job as a cafeteria worker. For 12 years, she'd successfully maintained the fiction that her technical understanding was limited to food service equipment. I used to work in technical fields before I took this job, Dorothy said carefully. I have some background in engineering systems, but Jake was studying her with new attention. What kind of engineering background? Dorothy looked toward the control room corridor, where she could see increasing activity among technical staff. The alarm tones were becoming more frequent and urgent, suggesting that whatever problems had started 2 hours ago were continuing to escalate. Nuclear engineering, Dorothy said quietly. I worked on reactor design and operations for 30 years before I retired and took this job. Jake nearly dropped his coffee cup. You're a nuclear engineer. Why are you working in the cafeteria? Because after 30 years of dealing with reactor crises, I wanted a job that let me serve people without carrying responsibility for nuclear safety decisions. But even as Dorothy spoke, she could hear alarm patterns that indicated the developing situation was moving beyond routine operational problems toward potential emergency conditions. Jake, I think you should tell your supervisor that someone with reactor operations experience is available for consultation if needed. Jake was struggling to reconcile the friendly cafeteria worker he'd known for years with someone claiming expert knowledge of nuclear reactor systems. Are you sure about your background? I mean, nuclear engineering is pretty specialized. Dorothy looked at the young technician with eyes that carried the weight of 3 decades managing some of the most complex and dangerous technology ever developed. Jake, I spent 30 years keeping reactors safe and operational. I can hear from these alarms that your cooling system problems are escalating toward potential emergency conditions. If your engineering team needs help, I'm qualified to provide it. 20 minutes later, Dorothy Henderson found herself walking through corridors she hadn't entered since taking the cafeteria job 12 years earlier. Jake had convinced his shift supervisor to allow the cafeteria worker with engineering background to consult on the developing cooling system crisis. Control room supervisor Mike Chen looked up from emergency procedure manuals as Dorothy entered the reactor control room. The space was filled with flashing warning lights, urgent alarm tones, and the controlled tension of professionals dealing with a potentially dangerous situation. Ma'am, I understand you have some engineering background that might help with our current situation. Dorothy scanned the control room displays with eyes trained by 3 decades of reactor operations. What she saw confirmed her worst fears and revealed problems that the current technical team hadn't yet identified. Supervisor Chen, you're dealing with a loss of coolant accident in combination with control rod insertion failure. Your primary concern should be preventing core temperature from exceeding fuel cladding limits. Chen stared at the woman in cafeteria uniform who'd just provided a technical assessment that matched the engineering team's conclusions. Ma'am, those are very specific technical terms. What exactly is your engineering background? 30 years reactor design and operations, including emergency response for the Department of Energy. I specialized in loss of coolant accidents and emergency cooling systems. The control room fell silent except for the continuing alarm tones. Chen was trying to process the information that the plant's cafeteria worker was actually a nuclear engineering expert with more experience than most of his technical staff. Dr. Henderson, if that's your background, why are you working in food service? Dorothy was already studying the reactor monitoring displays, her trained eye identifying problems that the current team was still trying to diagnose. Because after 30 years of reactor emergencies, I wanted peaceful work that didn't involve potential nuclear accidents. But right now, you have a developing situation that could threaten public safety if not handled correctly. Chen made a decision that would save Pine Valley Nuclear Plant and potentially 500,000 people in the surrounding area. Dr. Henderson, what do you recommend? Dorothy moved to the main reactor control panel, her hands finding instruments and controls with the muscle memory of thousands of hours of reactor operations. First, you need to implement emergency core cooling immediately. Your manual control systems for ECCS activation should bypass the automated systems that are clearly malfunctioning. We've tried ECCS activation. The system isn't responding properly. Dorothy's fingers moved over control switches with practiced precision. Because you're trying to activate it through computer control systems that are compromised by the same failures affecting your primary cooling, manual activation requires bypassing the automated systems entirely. What followed was a demonstration of nuclear engineering expertise that none of the Pine Valley staff had ever witnessed. Dorothy's approach was methodical, comprehensive, and devastatingly effective at diagnosing and correcting multiple system failures simultaneously. The control rod insertion failure is being caused by thermal expansion in the rod drive mechanisms, Dorothy explained as she worked. The loss of coolant is creating temperature variations that are affecting mechanical systems throughout the reactor. Chen watched in amazement as Dorothy implemented emergency procedures with speed and confidence that came from decades of experience managing similar crises. Dr. Henderson, how are you diagnosing these problems so quickly? Because I've dealt with loss of coolant accidents before, and I helped design many of the emergency systems you're using. The symptoms you're seeing follow predictable patterns when primary cooling systems fail. Dorothy's hands moved across the control panel, activating manual backup systems and implementing emergency cooling procedures that gradually brought the reactor's temperature back within safe operating parameters. Emergency core cooling is now functioning properly, Dorothy announced. Reactor temperature is decreasing, and control rod mechanisms should begin responding normally as thermal expansion effects diminish. Over the next 2 hours, Dorothy Henderson demonstrated why Department of Energy nuclear engineers were considered among the most skilled technical professionals in the world. She not only stopped the potential reactor emergency, but identified the root causes of the system failures and implemented long-term solutions that would prevent similar problems in the future. Dr. Henderson, Chen said, as reactor systems returned to normal operation, this was remarkable crisis management. How long have you been working here as a cafeteria employee? Dorothy was reviewing system status displays to ensure all emergency conditions had been properly resolved. 12 years. I took the food service job when I retired from nuclear engineering. But why hide your technical background? You could have had a senior position in our engineering department. Dorothy looked around the control room where she'd spent the morning preventing a potential nuclear emergency. Supervisor Chen, I spent 30 years of my life dealing with reactor crises, system failures, and the constant stress of knowing that mistakes could affect thousands of people. When I retired, I wanted work that would let me serve others without carrying that level of responsibility. Chen was studying Dorothy with growing respect and confusion. But you clearly still have the expertise to handle emergency situations. Having the expertise and wanting to use it daily are different things. I found peace in cafeteria work because it let me help people in a simpler way, without the psychological burden of nuclear safety responsibility. And today I made an exception because people's lives were at stake and I had knowledge that could help. But tomorrow, I'll go back to serving meals and letting younger engineers handle reactor operations. Over the following weeks, word of Dorothy's intervention spread throughout the nuclear industry. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission requested detailed reports on her emergency response techniques, and several major utilities offered her consulting positions at senior levels. But Dorothy Henderson returned to her cafeteria routine, content to let others handle the recognition and professional opportunities that accompanied successful nuclear crisis management. Dorothy, Mike Chen asked during one of his regular visits to the cafeteria, don't you miss the excitement and importance of nuclear engineering work? Dorothy was preparing lunch for the day shift, the same routine she'd followed for 12 years. Mike, there's nothing exciting about knowing that a calculation error could result in radiation exposure or reactor damage. I found excitement in work where the biggest crisis is running out of soup, but your expertise could prevent future emergencies. Don't you feel responsible for using your knowledge to keep reactors safe? Dorothy paused in her food preparation, considering a question that several people had asked since the emergency. I spent 30 years using my knowledge to keep nuclear facilities safe. I trained younger engineers, developed safety procedures, and managed more reactor emergencies than I care to remember. Now I use different skills to keep nuclear workers fed and comfortable. Both forms of service matter, but you're one of the most experienced nuclear engineers in the country, and I used that experience for 30 years in direct reactor work, then 12 more years providing support services to nuclear workers. When this emergency happened, I used my expertise because lives were at stake. But I don't need to return to daily nuclear engineering to fulfill my responsibility to the industry. 6 months later, Dorothy's emergency response techniques were incorporated into Nuclear Regulatory Commission training programs for reactor operators nationwide. Her analysis of the Pine Valley incident became a textbook example of expert crisis management under pressure. But Dorothy remained characteristically modest about her contributions. I just applied training and experience to a problem that younger engineers hadn't encountered before, she would say when asked about her role in preventing the potential emergency. Pine Valley Nuclear Plant implemented several safety improvements based on Dorothy's recommendations, and the facility's safety record improved significantly following her intervention. But Dorothy continued working in the cafeteria, content to let others implement the technical changes while she maintained her routine of serving meals to nuclear workers. Dr. Henderson, the plant manager, said during a ceremony recognizing her contributions to nuclear safety, "Your intervention prevented what could have been a serious nuclear incident. Have you considered returning to nuclear engineering work?" Dorothy accepted the recognition gracefully, but remained firm in her commitment to cafeteria work. "I'm honored by the recognition, but I've found satisfaction in this job that I never had during my nuclear engineering career. Every day, I contribute to the well-being of the people who keep this plant running safely. That's meaningful work that doesn't require me to carry the stress of reactor responsibility. But your expertise could help improve nuclear safety across the industry. My expertise did help improve nuclear safety for 30 years of direct engineering work and through my analysis of this specific emergency. Now I want to contribute to nuclear safety by keeping nuclear workers well-fed and comfortable, which supports their ability to do their technical jobs effectively. 3 years later, when nuclear engineers gathered for conferences on reactor safety, Dorothy Henderson's emergency response was studied as an example of expert crisis management. But Dorothy herself remained absent from these professional gatherings, content to continue her cafeteria routine. Her story became legendary in nuclear industry circles. The nuclear engineer who'd walked away from reactor work to find peace in food service, then emerged from retirement for one crucial day to prevent a potential nuclear emergency. But Dorothy preferred the version of her story that her cafeteria colleagues knew, a dedicated food service worker who took pride in maintaining nutrition standards and occasionally demonstrated unexpected technical knowledge. The most important thing, Dorothy would tell new cafeteria staff, is understanding that every job at a nuclear facility contributes to safety. Whether you're operating reactors or serving meals, you're helping maintain the kind of workplace where people can focus on keeping nuclear technology safe. She'd learned something important during her transition from nuclear engineer to cafeteria worker. True satisfaction came not from the complexity of your work, but from knowing that your service helped others succeed in their responsibilities. Expertise is a tool, she would explain to young nuclear engineers who sought her advice. How you use that tool depends on what kind of life you want to build. I chose to use my expertise occasionally, when it was truly needed, rather than making it the center of my daily existence. Sometimes the most skilled nuclear engineers are serving coffee in plant cafeterias, content to let others handle the daily challenges of reactor operations. Sometimes the person who knows your favorite sandwich order once designed the safety systems that protect your community. Sometimes the cafeteria worker who always has a warm smile spent decades preventing the kind of nuclear emergencies that most people never know were possible. Dorothy Henderson had spent 30 years mastering nuclear technology, then 12 more years finding peace in simple service. When reactor crisis demanded her expertise for one crucial day, she proved that true professionals never really retire. They just find different ways to serve the industries and communities they've sworn to protect. Have you ever discovered that someone's technical background was far more impressive than their current job suggested? Tell us about it in the comments below. And if this story reminds you to appreciate the quiet professionals around you, subscribe to Unseen Legends for more tales of hidden expertise. Because sometimes the person serving your lunch once designed the nuclear safety systems that keep your city safe. And when reactor emergencies threaten public safety, that expertise might be exactly what prevents disaster and saves thousands of lives. This story is a work of fiction created to honor the spirit of technical expertise and the dedicated professionals who ensure nuclear safety. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental,